Edward Bennett had it all: wealth, power, influence. But one decision he made years ago would come back to haunt him in ways he never expected. What happens when the past catches up with him and the truth he tried to bury resurfaces? Stay with us until the end to see a story that will leave you speechless. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything. Edward Bennett had everything a man could dream of: wealth, power, and influence. His name echoed through the high-rise offices of the business world, a symbol of success carved out through sheer determination and relentless ambition. People admired him, envied him, feared him, but few knew the man behind the title. Few knew of his deepest shame, a truth he kept hidden even from himself. Years ago, Edward had risen from nothing, a black man in a society that fought to keep him down. His success was a badge of honor, a testament to his refusal to be defined by prejudice or hardship. He built his empire brick by brick, one deal at a time, defying every obstacle in his path. But there was one challenge he couldn't overcome: his own son. When James was born, Edward had imagined raising a boy who would follow in his footsteps, a prodigy who would carry on the Bennett legacy. But fate had other plans. James was different. The doctors confirmed it when he was only 2 years old. He was deaf. The words hit Edward like a hammer. His son would never hear his voice, never share in the conversations that shaped the world of business. Edward saw it as a curse, a flaw that couldn't be fixed. And in Edward's world, flaws were unacceptable. His wife Maria begged him to reconsider, to see James for the bright, curious boy he was. But Edward couldn't. He couldn't reconcile the idea of his perfect heir with a child who couldn't hear. He felt trapped, angry at a world that had given him so much yet cursed him with what he saw as a burden. And so he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. James was sent away to an institution for children with special needs. It was done quietly, without fanfare. Edward couldn't bear the idea of anyone knowing about his son's condition. He told himself it was for the best, that James would be better off in a place where he could get the help he needed. But deep down, Edward knew the truth. He had abandoned his son out of pride. Years passed, and Edward's empire grew. He became a household name, a symbol of what was possible for a black man in a white-dominated world. He reveled in his achievements, basking in the glow of success. But James was never far from his thoughts. The guilt gnawed at him, a constant reminder of what he had sacrificed for his ambitions. Meanwhile, James grew up in silence, feeling the sting of his father's rejection every day. He learned to navigate a world that wasn't built for him. He faced prejudice not only for being black, but also for being deaf. But James was resilient. He refused to be defined by his limitations. He learned to read lips, to communicate through sign language, to adapt to a world that often dismissed him. By the time he was in his 20s, James had become a man of quiet strength. He didn't seek his father's approval anymore. He had long since given up on the idea that Edward would ever accept him. Instead, he focused on building his own life, carving out his own path in the shadows of his father's empire. Unbeknownst to Edward, James had been watching him from afar, studying the world of business with a keen eye. He absorbed everything he could, determined to prove that he was just as capable, if not more so, than the man who had cast him aside. He saw his father's empire as a challenge, a mountain he would one day climb. The opportunity came when James discovered that one of Edward's key holdings was in trouble. A rival company was making moves to buy it out, threatening to destabilize Edward's entire portfolio. James saw his chance. Quietly, he began to acquire shares in the struggling company, using his savings and clever investments to secure a controlling interest. When Edward found out, he was livid. He stormed into a board meeting, demanding to know who had orchestrated the buyout. His fury turned to shock when he saw James sitting at the head of the table, calm and composed, a silent force to be reckoned with. "You?" Edward's voice trembled with disbelief. "You did this?" James met his father's gaze without flinching. He didn't need words to convey his message. The look in his eyes said everything. He wasn't the helpless boy Edward had once sent away. He was a man now, a man who had just taken a piece of his father's empire. Edward left the meeting in a daze. He couldn't believe it. His son, the son he had dismissed as weak, had outmaneuvered him. The realization shook him to his core. For the first time in his life, Edward felt the weight of his actions, the consequences of his pride and arrogance. At home that night, Edward sat in his study staring at the family photo on his desk. It was old, taken before James was born. His wife had left him years ago, unable to forgive his decision to send their son away. Edward had always told himself that it was for the best, that he had made the right choice for everyone. But now he wasn't so sure. He thought about James, about the man his son had become. There was a strength in James that Edward hadn't seen before, a quiet determination that spoke volumes. Edward realized that he had underestimated his son, just as the world had once underestimated him. The following week, Edward made a decision. He would reach out to James. It was time to make things right. He couldn't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, there was still time to mend what had been broken. As he dialed James's number, Edward felt a surge of hope. But when the call went unanswered, that hope began to fade. The tension in the air was thick as Edward Bennett sat in his office, staring at the documents spread out before him. His company, his empire, was no longer entirely his. The realization gnawed at him. James had not only acquired a significant portion of his holdings, but he had done so quietly, strategically, without Edward even noticing. It was a move that mirrored Edward's own tactics from years ago, and it unsettled him deeply. He couldn't shake the image of his son sitting confidently at the head of that boardroom table. The silent gaze James had given him spoke volumes. It wasn't just a business move, it was personal. Edward knew that. It was a statement. James wasn't just taking control of a company, he was reclaiming his place in the world Edward had tried to push him out of. And Edward was left grappling with the consequences of his past actions. Days passed, and Edward couldn't focus. His mind kept drifting back to James, to the boy he had sent away so many years ago. He remembered the look on Maria's face the day he made the decision. She had begged him not to do it, had pleaded with him to see James for who he truly was, a bright, curious child with so much potential. But Edward had been too blinded by his own ambitions. He had seen James's deafness as a weakness, something that would hinder the legacy he was building. He had convinced himself that he was making the right choice, that James would be better off in an institution where he could receive the help he needed. Now, all those justifications felt hollow. Edward sat alone in his study late one night, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The house was quiet, too quiet. He thought back to the days when it had been filled with laughter and warmth, when Maria would play the piano and James would sit beside her, his little hands tapping along to the rhythm. Edward had never joined them. He had always been too busy, too focused on his work. And when James's condition became apparent, Edward had distanced himself even further. It was easier that way, easier to pretend that his son didn't exist, easier to focus on building his empire without the burden of guilt weighing him down. But that guilt had never truly left him. It had lingered in the back of his mind, a constant reminder of what he had done. And now, seeing James as a grown man, strong, successful, and determined, it was impossible to ignore. Edward knew he had to make amends, but he didn't know how. He had spent his entire life building walls around himself, shutting out anything that threatened to make him vulnerable. Opening those walls now felt impossible. The next morning, Edward made a decision. He would go to James in person. He wouldn't wait for a phone call or an email. He needed to look his son in the eyes, to acknowledge the man he had become, and to try, somehow, to bridge the gap between them. He wasn't sure what he would say, but he knew he couldn't let things continue the way they were. He had already lost too much time. Arriving at James's office building, Edward felt a strange mix of emotions, nervousness, regret, even a hint of fear. He wasn't used to feeling uncertain. He had spent his life commanding rooms, making decisions, and leading with confidence. But now, standing in front of the receptionist's desk, he felt out of place, like a man out of his depth. "I'm here to see James Bennett," Edward said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. The receptionist glanced up, her expression polite but curious. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Edward admitted, "but I'm his father." The words felt heavy as they left his mouth. It had been years since he had identified himself that way. For so long, he had distanced himself from James, pretending that part of his life didn't exist. But now, he was claiming it. He was acknowledging the bond they shared, however broken it might be. The receptionist made a quick phone call, and a few moments later, Edward was escorted to James's office. As he stepped inside, he saw his son standing by the window, looking out at the city skyline. James didn't turn around right away. He seemed lost in thought, his posture relaxed but his presence commanding. Edward couldn't help but feel a pang of pride mixed with regret. James had become everything Edward had once hoped for in a successor: strong, intelligent, driven. But he had done it without his father's guidance. Finally, James turned to face him. His expression was calm, but there was a guardedness in his eyes, a wall that Edward knew he had built over years of hurt and rejection. "Edward," James said, his voice steady but distant. He didn't call him Dad. That word felt foreign now, a relic of a relationship that had never truly existed. "I wanted to see you," Edward began, taking a hesitant step forward. "I needed to." James said nothing, waiting for him to continue. Edward took a deep breath. "I know I've made mistakes. I've been thinking a lot about the past, about the choices I made. And I realize now how much I've hurt you." James's expression didn't change. He remained silent, his gaze unwavering. Edward felt the weight of his own words, the truth of them sinking in deeper with each passing moment. "I was wrong," Edward continued. "I thought I was doing what was best for you, for all of us. But I see now that I was only thinking about myself, about my own fears and insecurities. I was afraid of what your condition would mean for my legacy, for my image. And I let that fear drive me to make a terrible decision." James crossed his arms, his posture still guarded. "Why now?" he finally asked. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a hint of the pain he had carried for so long. Why are you here now, after all these years?" Edward struggled to find the right words. "Because I see you, I see the man you've become, and I'm proud of you." James's expression softened for a moment, but the wall remained. "Proud? You're proud now? After you abandoned me? After you left me to figure everything out on my own?" Edward nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Yes, I'm proud. You've accomplished more than I ever could have imagined. And I regret that I wasn't there to support you." James turned back to the window, his back to Edward. There was a long silence before he spoke again. "I didn't need your support. I learned to survive without it." Edward felt the sting of those words, but he knew they were true. James had built his success on his own, without any help from his father. And that was what made his achievements all the more remarkable. "I want to make things right," Edward said quietly. "I know I can't change the past, but I want to be part of your life now. I want to support you, to help you in any way I can." James turned around again, his expression unreadable. "You can't just walk in here and expect everything to be okay. You can't undo the years you took from me." Edward nodded slowly. "I know, but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." James studied him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "We'll see." It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't reconciliation, but it was a start. The days that followed were filled with silence. James had not reached out after their conversation in his office, and Edward was left wondering if he had done the right thing by showing up unannounced. The uncertainty gnawed at him, a feeling he wasn't used to. For most of his life, Edward had been in control of his business, his image, his legacy. But now, with James standing firmly on his own, Edward realized just how little control he had over what truly mattered. Sitting in his empty house one evening, Edward stared at a framed photograph of James as a child. It was one of the few pictures he had kept after sending James away. In the photo, James was smiling, his bright eyes full of curiosity and innocence. Edward remembered the day it was taken. James had just learned to tie his shoes, a small victory that had filled him with pride. Back then, Edward had seen his son as a reflection of himself, someone who would carry on the Bennett name with pride and strength. But when James's deafness was diagnosed, that image shattered. Edward had felt betrayed by life, unable to accept a version of his son that didn't fit his expectations. The knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. For a moment, Edward sat frozen, unsure if he had imagined it. But then it came again, more insistent. He rose from his chair and walked to the door, opening it to find James standing on the porch. The sight of his son took Edward by surprise. James looked composed, but there was an intensity in his eyes that hinted at unresolved emotions. "May I come in?" James asked, his voice calm but firm. Edward nodded quickly and stepped aside to let him in. As James entered, Edward couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. The last time they had been in this house together, James had been a boy, too young to understand the choices his father was making. Now he was a man who had forged his own path despite the obstacles Edward had placed in his way. They walked into the living room where Edward gestured for James to sit. James remained standing, his gaze fixed on the photograph Edward had been holding moments before. "That's an old picture," James said quietly. "I remember that day." Edward placed the photograph back on the table, his hands trembling slightly. "You were always a bright kid, smarter than I gave you credit for." James turned to face his father, his expression unreadable. "Why did you do it?" The question hung in the air, heavy with years of pain and confusion. "Why did you send me away?" Edward sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. He had anticipated this question, but hearing it aloud made it harder to answer. "I was scared," he admitted. "I didn't know how to handle it. Your deafness, the challenges you would face. I thought I was protecting you by sending you to a place where you could get the help you needed. But the truth is, I was protecting myself. I didn't want to face the reality that my son wasn't the image I had built in my mind." James crossed his arms, his posture still guarded. "You didn't just send me away. You erased me. You acted like I didn't exist." Edward winced at the harshness of those words, but he knew they were true. "I thought I was doing the right thing at the time. I thought I was making the best decision for everyone." James shook his head slowly. "It wasn't the best decision for me." Silence fell between them, thick with unspoken emotions. Edward struggled to find the right words, but everything he thought to say felt inadequate. How could he explain years of absence, years of rejection in a single conversation? "I can't change what I did," Edward finally said, "but I want to try to make things right now." James's expression softened, but only slightly. "Why now? Why after all this time?" Edward met his son's gaze, his eyes filled with regret. "Because I see you now. I see the man you've become, and I'm proud of you. I was wrong to underestimate you. I was wrong to think you couldn't succeed on your own. You've proven me wrong in every way." James took a step closer, his eyes searching Edward's face for sincerity. "Do you really mean that?" Edward nodded. Every word. For the first time in years, James allowed himself to let down his guard, if only slightly. He sat down across from his father, leaning forward with his hands clasped together. "It wasn't easy," he said, "growing up without you. I had to figure everything out on my own, but I did it. I built my life without your help." "And you did an incredible job," Edward said quietly, "more than I ever could have imagined." James let out a bitter laugh. "Funny, isn't it? You spent your whole life building a legacy, and now that legacy is in my hands." Edward smiled faintly, though there was sadness in his eyes. "It is, and you've earned it." They sat in silence for a moment, both men lost in their thoughts. Edward felt a glimmer of hope, a possibility that their fractured relationship could be mended, but he knew it would take time. Trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight. "I'm not looking for an apology," James said finally. "I don't need you to say you're sorry. What I need is to know that you're willing to change, that you're willing to be part of my life, not as a businessman, but as a father." Edward's heart ached at those words. "I am. I want that more than anything." James studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Then we'll see where this goes." It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a start, a step toward healing the wounds of the past. Edward knew there was still a long way to go, but for the first time in years he felt hope. Hope that he hadn't lost his son completely. Hope that there was still a chance to build something real, something lasting. As James stood to leave, Edward walked him to the door. They stood in silence for a moment before James spoke again. "Next time, don't wait for me to come to you," James said. "If you want to be part of my life, show up." Edward nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I will." James gave a small nod before turning and walking away, leaving Edward standing on the porch, watching him go. As he disappeared into the night, Edward felt the weight of his past lifting, replaced by the possibility of a better future. Closing the door behind him, Edward returned to the living room and picked up the photograph of James as a child. He traced the edges of the frame with his fingers, a smile playing at the corners of his lips. There was still work to be done, mistakes to be corrected, bridges to be rebuilt. But for the first time in a long time, Edward felt that he was on the right path. It wasn't too late. The choices we make today can echo through the years. Edward learned that some mistakes are impossible to undo, but it's never too late to try to make things right. What do you think about this story? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories. Your support means the world.